Well, talking about Cuba, you ask why I'm interested in Cuba. As you mentioned, Arizona doesn't have a lot of ag trade. They don't want to buy cactus in Cuba. There's not a real reason there. I like to tell people I took a poll among Cuban Americans in Arizona, and both of them said, just move right ahead. We like what you're doing. Go ahead. So, but to me, it's just been really an issue of freedom. Americans should be able to travel wherever they want, unless there's a compelling national security reason, and there hasn't been with Cuba for a long, long time. But rather than go through a laundry list of why I think we ought to lift the travel ban and, frankly, the entire embargo, I would do the whole thing. I thought that I would just go through a few myths that are out there that are often brought up by the opponents of the new policy in Cuba. The myth one that I'll address is don't change a thing. We have the Castro regime just where we want them. They're on the ropes. They won't last much longer. Now, this policy has been going for 50 years. And no doubt the Cuban economy is not in a good place. They're heavily reliant on subsidized oil coming from Venezuela. They're not doing well. The average wage is about $20 a month. Their economy is in tough shape. But they have been through worse, if you can believe it, particularly in the early 90s when the Soviet Union disintegrated and those subsidies stopped. They went through what they called the special period. And it was quite a time. Conditions now are tough, but they don't approach what went on during that time, and still the regime lasted. People will say, well, Raul Castro is there now. When he goes, there will be no more Castros in office, and then things will change. And not necessarily. I don't think we ought to count on that. This is a system that may endure beyond, or will endure beyond the Castros, and unless we find a more effective way to influence it. The myth number two, that we have to continue the isolation of Cuba, isolation for one, isolation for all kind of attitude. I would simply point out that isolation of Cuba is kind of a myth. We are Cuba's 5th largest trading partner. Since the year 2000 or so, we've been trading a lot, particularly in agricultural products. At a peak of 2007 or 8, of about, I think, $800 million. It's now just over $400 million. Some of the changes with financing have brought that down a bit. But there's a lot of U.S. trade with Cuba. Cuba obviously trades with just about every other country in the world as well. And I should mention that one figure I found interesting, a full quarter of Alabama's agricultural revenue comes from exports to Cuba. So when you look at different pockets around the country, there's a lot of trade going on and a lot of people reliant on it, and you have a lot of people in the farm community who want to see that obviously increased. Outside of trade, we also have a lot of people visiting Cuba. Since the president loosened restrictions on Cuban-American travel in 2009, visits last year were up at about 400,000 a year. 400,000, mostly Cuban-Americans, traveling back to the island, sometimes several times. So that has been significant. And I should mention that those who say that now they're going to turn back the president's new policy, loosening travel again, even more so, many of them said the same thing in 2009. We're not going to let this stand. We're going to turn that back. And nobody, you don't hear any of those voices who said that, willing to turn back Cuban-American travel. Because once people get a little more freedom, they want even more of it. And that's just an axiom, I think, that we can all rely on. And when travel happens, then it's tough to turn it back. So I think that certainly we ought to recognize that Cuba is better off because of the travel, and we're better off because of it as well. I should mention that part of my motivation is to have more Cubans exposed to American values, and that happens when more Americans travel. And part of my reasoning also is to expose Americans to what's happening in Cuba. Under the policy that we've had for so many years, it's been easy for movie stars and others to travel to Cuba. And so you have Kevin Costner and Oliver Stone and others going to Cuba and then talking about when they come back, this land flowing with milk and honey and wonderful healthcare, education, science, all these wonderful things happening in Cuba and how Fidel Castro is such a genius. And I've always thought that if Bob from Peoria went down to Cuba, he'd have a different reaction. And everybody ought to be able to travel and see what happens when government controls not just the commanding heights of the economy, but the entire economy. It's a sobering experience, and I think that more Americans ought to be exposed to it. I was on a trip one time to Poland, and we met with Lech Wałęsa. And that was a great treat. He's a wonderful, incredible man, given his history. And we were having a conversation. Just all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he stopped the conversation. He said, "I just don't understand your policy toward Cuba." and my ears perked up on that. He said, "You have a museum of socialism 90 miles away, and you don't let people go to it." They ought to go. They ought to experience it. I thought it was an interesting comment coming from him. Myth number 3. Anything we do will only line the pockets of the regime. People will point out that as more Americans travel, because the Cuban government owns, the military is in charge of resorts and hotels and is so enmeshed in the economy there that any money that goes to Cuba, any travel will simply line the pockets of the regime. There is no doubt that, and anybody who tries to say that no money will go to the Cuban government when Americans travel is not telling you the truth. Sure, some of it will, a lot of it will. But also, for those to say that all money from travel and economic activity or anything that happens in Cuba only benefits the regime are equally not telling you the truth. You know how every communist system has leakage, seepage. You talk about the works of Hernando de Soto, talking about The Mystery of Capital, a wonderful book he wrote about how there's just underground economies everywhere. That's certainly true in Cuba. Plus, some of the changes that have taken place in Cuba officially. Now, after during the special period in the 90s, the Cuban government relaxed a lot of restrictions, allowing people to start private restaurants. When that special period kind of ended, the Cuban government cracked down again and revoked a lot of those licenses and pulled back. And there's no guarantee that they won't do so again, but I can tell you, right now, according to a lot of research, about 20% of the 5 million person workforce in Cuba can be classified as in the private sector. That's an increase of about 150% just over the last couple of years. The Cuban government has recognized that their ability to run restaurants and other private businesses is extremely inefficient, and they simply cannot prepare or provide for the entire population, so they have allowed many to go outside of it. Barbershops, restaurants, and other businesses, their classification of, I think, 201 occupations that now can happen outside of the government. And my sense in traveling to Cuba over the last couple of years, unlike the previous years that I traveled there, is that these gains in the private sector are more irreversible, far more difficult for the Cuban government to reverse, particularly because a lot of these gains have been because of private investment allowed under the president's policy in 2009, allowing for virtually unlimited remittances. Now they are unlimited, going from Cuban Americans to family members and others on the island. So when Americans will travel there, there will be benefits to ordinary Cubans. And not just that, and not just in terms of money and goods taken down, but we've had these programs, so-called democracy programs. We spend about $20 million a year, one of which was the program that got Alan Gross put in jail, great goal, trying to get more Cubans connected to the internet and exposed to information on the outside. But my notion has always been that if you allowed completely unfettered travel to the island, that you would accomplish that goal far more quickly, far more efficiently. You could probably accomplish in a couple of weeks what you've been trying to do for 20 years in terms of allowing and giving access to Cubans to information and technology.